Well, today the US Weekly, The Nation, published an article that I've written called Beyond Austerity, and I just thought I'd talk a bit about the thoughts that went into writing that article. In December 2009, the US President made the most extraordinary statement. We don't have enough public dollars to fill the hole of private dollars that was created as a consequence of this crisis. And that told me one thing, and only one thing, that the logic that had driven policy, the neoliberal logic that had driven economic policy in the period leading up to the crisis, and which had caused the crisis, was still dominating, despite the crisis exposing the flaws in that logic and rendering statements by proponents of that logic as absolute lies. And that's what that statement told me, the statement by the President. Now, since then, the lies that got us into the crisis in the first place, the statements by economists that self-regulating markets would deliver prosperity to all of us, that the main macroeconomic challenges had been solved. This was the so-called Great Moderation, that the role of government was no longer to use fiscal and monetary policy to ensure that we had high levels of employment and strong economic growth, rather that macroeconomic policy had to, manifested in terms of monetary policy, setting of interest rates, had to concentrate on inflation alone, and that fiscal policy had to remain passive to support monetary policy with a bias towards what I call fiscal drag, that is running surpluses if possible, but maintaining a tight grip on total spending. And the idea of a self-regulating market led to a whole range of legislative initiatives which deregulated the financial markets, deregulated the labour markets, and really set the conditions up for the massive crisis that we entered. One of the characteristic features of the neoliberal period has been the way in which labour markets have been deregulated, and a manifestation of that, the attack on unions, the constraining forces on real wages growth, has been the massive redistribution of national income in most countries towards profits away from labour. In Australia, over the last 30 years, we've seen that redistribution approximately of 10 percentage points. In the late 70s, the wage share would have been around 60%, and now it's around 51% and continuing to fall. Now, that massive redistribution of income provided the largesse for the financial sector to go on their binge, and the ability to use that redistribution of real income was aided and abetted by the legislative changes and the changes in regulations in the way banking systems could operate, the reduction in the requirements for the creation of mortgages and credit in general, and the very significant increase in what I call financial engineering. And we had these stories in the press of young children receiving credit cards in the post with credit limits of $20,000 or something like that. And this was all part of the build-up to the crisis. And what's extraordinary is that all of those justifications which pressured governments to bring in rules and legislative changes were based on lies. They were based upon mainstream economic theory, which has now been demonstrated categorically to be incorrect, incapable of describing the monetary system that we all live in. And now, the mainstream economists didn't predict the crisis, and certainly in the early stages of it they were advocating policies which would have worsened it. Now governments are being pressured to cut back deficits, to cut back public spending, with this idea that you have a fiscal contraction expansion. There's some mysterious psychology operating among households and business firms who are allegedly terrified of budget deficits, who will immediately start spending once the government announces and enacts an intention to cut its spending. And these are the sort of lies that are sitting behind the push for austerity. And in the article that I wrote for The Nation, I analyse each of those lies, I document them, and I provide some alternative viewpoint based upon an understanding of the way the monetary system actually operates, and an understanding of the opportunities that that monetary system provides a government whose aim is to advance public purpose and well-being, rather than support the redistribution of national income to profit, rather than introduce legislation that attacks trade unions and undermines the working conditions of the most disadvantaged workers, rather than a government that deliberately introduces policies that create unemployment and entrench that state. So the public debate is severely in need of balance. And in that context, I'm really glad that The Nation, which is a high-profile weekly in the US, has chosen to start running stories that provide some balance, some alternative viewpoint, that take us beyond the austerity myths and provide us with some blueprint through which governments can actually reverse this nonsensical stances that they're taking at the moment, which will only damage their economies and the communities that define those economies. And it's somewhat, I'm not sure what the word is. I was going to say serendipitous, or it's certainly not interesting. But this week we had some key economic data from Ireland and Britain, labour market data, the release of the fourth quarter Irish labour market statistics for 2010, and the most recent data for Britain. And there's only one word to describe both data releases: atrocious. Ireland began its austerity push. It's the darling of the deficit terrorists. It started its austerity push early in 2009. Things have been getting worse ever since, and they will continue to get worse until the government realises that you cannot have a fiscal contraction expansion, that these households who are allegedly terrified of tax increases to pay back deficits will not start spending as public spending falls. They fear unemployment. They will see rising unemployment, and they will continue to save as the only viable risk management strategy they have. And the business firms equally will not start investing, because as the unemployment rises and the households save, they will see the falling spending as inventory accumulation. And the number one rule in macroeconomics is spending equals income. And nobody's going to spend unless they anticipate that they will have jobs and they will be able to sell the goods and services, these are the investors, that they produce. And that's the reality. And the data that's coming out this week, the labour market data, where Ireland now has an unemployment rate of 14.7% and rising, that Britain has a rising unemployment rate now above 8%. The Irish economy is shedding jobs at a very fast pace. And one of the things that's holding down their atrocious unemployment rate is that they're losing thousands of people every month via emigration in search of jobs. Now, by any measure, the data is telling us that the austerity strategy is as you'd expect. It's making the situation worse. And so I've tried to articulate the conceptual basis of that statement in the article in The Nation, and as I try to do each day in my blog. So I hope you enjoy reading it, and I'll see you later.